Okay, so continuing our theme on international business, what I want to look at today is the European Union, which Ireland is a member of. And the European Union is a trading bloc of 27 countries in Europe, including Ireland. The countries are called member states. There is free trade between all the member states in the EU. This is called the single market. Now, where that benefits us is it means you don't have tariffs that you have to pay to get your goods into other countries. But the EU is more than just a free trade area. Although each member is a sovereign, independent country, they have pooled some of their sovereignty in order to gain strength and benefit from size. Pooling sovereignty means, in practice, that the member states delegate some of their decision-making powers to the shared institutions of the EU that have been created by all the member states. There are 27 member states, and they are as follows: Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, and Sweden. UK used to be a member of the EU, but they voted in June 2016 to leave the EU. It's known as Brexit, and they were due to have left the EU by March 2019. Now, it turned out that it was significantly later than that, but they have now finally left. They have instigated what was called Article 50, and they have left the EU. Now, they're still working out their customs deal and all that sort of stuff, but they're now not part of the EU. There are different EU institutions, and they are as follows: the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, the European Court of Auditors, the Court of Justice, the European Council. So let's have a look at these one by one. So first of all, the European Commission, what does it do? The European Commission is one of the main institutes of the European Union. It represents and upholds the interests of the EU as a whole. It manages the day-to-day business of implementing the EU policies and spending EU funds. It consists of commissioners. Each commissioner is in charge of a different area of responsibility within the EU, such as transport, the environment, education, health, agriculture, and trade. So the main functions of the Commission are to propose new European laws. So the Commission instigates legislation in the EU. This means that it thinks up ideas for new laws to protect the EU and its citizens. To get the technical details of the new law right, it consults with experts through various committees and groups. It also holds public consultations. The Commission then produces a draft of the proposed new law and sends it to the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament for their opinions and approval. These new laws, when passed, will have a direct influence on Ireland. For example, the Commission thought of the idea of the minimum wage. This law has a direct effect on the lives of Irish workers. It improved the standard of living for many of them. It also has a direct effect on Irish businesses because it increased their costs. So another purpose of the European Commission is to enforce the EU laws. So they write them and they enforce them. The Commission supervises the EU to make sure that everyone obeys the EU laws. It is known as the guardian of the treaties. If it thinks a national government is failing to apply an EU law, the Commission first sends an official letter asking it to correct the problem. As a last resort, the Commission refers the issue to the Court of Justice to force that country to obey the law. The court can impose penalties, and its decisions are binding on EU countries and institutions. The Commission is responsible for making sure that the EU policies are carried out properly. For example, the EU Commission policies states that all businesses must follow the principles of fair competition. To make sure this is adhered to, the Commission keeps an eye on all mergers and takeovers that take place in the EU. It can stop any mergers or takeovers if it thinks they will harm free competition. In 2013, for example, the Commission did not allow Ryanair to take over Aer Lingus, stating that such a takeover was a threat to consumer choice and a recipe for higher fares. In August 2016, the Commission ruled that Ireland granted illegal tax benefits to Apple, which enabled it to pay less tax than other businesses, and it ordered Apple to pay the Irish government €13 billion in back taxes. So another role of the Commission is to draft the EU budget. The Commission is responsible for drawing up the EU budget. This means that it makes the initial decision as to where EU funds are to be spent, including how much money each country should get back from the EU. This is important for Ireland because the Commission decides how much money Ireland will get from the EU. This money is important to Ireland because it is used to build up our infrastructure and develop the poorer parts of the country. XLC, in fact, benefits from that EU budget because any little bit of money that we get from a thing called the Back to Education allowance is actually an EU source of funding. So if it wasn't for that EU budget and the money that's allocated to the countries, we wouldn't have any funding at all whatsoever. Another function of the EU is to represent the EU internationally. The Commission speaks on behalf of all EU countries on international matters such as trade and policy and humanitarian aid, and in international bodies like the World Trade Organization, and at the moment during this coronavirus, it consults with the World Health Organization. In these areas, the European Commission acts as an important spokesperson for the European Union on the international stage. It enables the 27 member states to speak with one voice in international forums. So the next thing then is the European Parliament. The European Parliament is the institution that is directly elected by the citizens of EU. So when you vote in European elections, this is what you're voting in, the European Parliament. It is to represent the country's interests in discussion with other EU institutions. Elections to the Parliament are held every 5 years. The number of MPs, that's the members of the European Parliament, for each country is roughly in proportion to its population. Under the Lisbon Treaty, no country can have fewer than 6 or more than 96 MPs. The job of the European Parliament and the MPs are to debate and approve new European law. So the Parliament considers the laws that are proposed by the Commission. The MEPs discuss the advantages and the disadvantages of the law and suggest any changes that they think will make the law better. Under what's called the ordinary legislative procedure, the Parliament and the Council of the EU jointly have to agree proposals for a new law. Thus, the Parliament gets to vote yes or no to new EU laws. It has power to block a proposal from becoming law. So another function of the European Parliament is to supervise the EU. The Parliament exercises influence over the European institution in several ways. The Parliament keeps an eye on what the Council of the European Union is doing. It calls the President of the Council, the Prime Minister of whichever country holds the EU presidency. So basically, the presidency of the Council rotates, and the president will be whoever the leader of the country is. So say, for example, if Ireland right now had the presidency of the EU, it would be Leo Varadkar, because he's our Taoiseach at the moment, who would be the president of the EU. So that's how it works. When it's your country's turn to be the president of the EU, it's the leader of your country who is also the president of the EU for that period. So it calls the president of the council into the parliament to answer questions from the MEPs about its work. When national leaders meet for European Council summits, the President of the European Parliament is invited to express Parliament's views and concerns about topical issues and items on the European Council's agenda. When a new commission is to be appointed, Parliament holds interviews with all the prospective new commissioners and presidents of the Commission. They cannot be appointed without Parliament's approval. Furthermore, the Commission is politically answerable to Parliament, which can pass a motion of censure, calling for its mass resignation. More generally, Parliament exercises control by regularly examining reports sent to it by the Commission and asking written and oral questions of the Commissioners. So it then has to also approve the EU budget. So the Parliament has the power, together with the Council of the EU, to approve or reject the entire EU budget. It votes yes or no to the EU budget. Thus, it has the power to block the entire budget drawn up by the Commission, which forces the Commission to come up with another budget. Therefore, it can influence how the EU spends its money. Parliament has a committee that monitors how the budget is spent, and every year passes judgment on the Commission's handling of the previous year's budget. So next is the Council of the European Union. This institution is the most important decision-making body in the EU. It is where national ministers from each EU country meet to adopt laws and coordinate policies. It represents the member states, and its meetings are attended by one minister from each of the EU national governments. If the Council is meeting to discuss the environment, for example, each country will send its government environment minister to represent it. If the Council is meeting to discuss financial issues, each country will send its government minister responsible for finances. So in our case at the moment, that would be Pascal O'Donoghue. I'm looking at the dog, he's trying to eat the swing set. Scruffy, give it over! Stop now. The decisions in the Council of the EU are taken by qualified majority as a general rule. The bigger a country's population, the more votes it has. The main functions of the Council of the EU are as follows. First of all, to pass European laws. Under the ordinary legislative procedure, the Council of the EU and the European Parliament share the final say on the proposals of a new law. Thus, the Council of the EU gets to vote yes or no to new EU laws. It has the power to block a proposal from becoming law. The next thing that the Council of the European Union can do is to approve the EU budget. So you'll see a lot of the topics are the same: laws, budgets, policies, that sort of thing. The Council of the EU has the power, together with the European Parliament, to approve or reject the entire EU budget. It votes yes or no to the EU budget. Thus, it has the power to block the budget being drawn up by the Commission, which again, like with the EU Parliament, forces the Commission to come up with an altogether new budget. Therefore, it can influence how the EU spends its money. So it also coordinates policy. The Council is responsible for coordinating Member States' policy in specific fields, such as economic and fiscal policies. Fiscal means how your money is spent. All Member States are members of the Economic Monetary Union, often referred to as the EMU. So if you see the letters EMU coming up in your short questions, it means Economic and Monetary Union. The EU common policy is based on the close coordination of national economic policies. The Council of the EU does this by monitoring the budgetary policies of each country and issuing them with recommendations for improvement. So then, to cooperate on foreign and defence policy. The Council defines and implements EU foreign and security policy on the basis of guidelines set by the European Council. This also includes the EU's development and humanitarian aid, defence, and trade. Together with the High Representatives of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, the Council ensures the unity, consistency, and effectiveness of the EU international policy. So the next institution to look at is the European Court of Auditors. So the European Court of Auditors, represented by the letters ECA, so again, in your short questions, if you see the letters ECA, it's the European Court of Auditors. This is the independent external audit institution of the European Union. It checks that the union's income has been received correctly, that its expenditure has been incurred in a legal and regular manner, and that financial management has been sound. It performs its tasks independently from the other EU institutions and government, and in doing so, it contributes to improving the management of the EU funds in the interests of its citizens. Its main functions are: the European Court of Auditors can audit any country or organisation that received EU funding to make sure that the money was not wasted and was spent for the purpose intended. This means that it investigates the paperwork of the organisation and carries out on-the-spot checks to make sure that everything was done correctly. The court writes a report on its findings, and this draws the attention of the Commission and EU national governments to any problems. It also represents the European Parliament and the Council of the EU. It presents the EU Parliament and the Council of the EU with an annual report on the previous financial year. This is called the annual discharge. Parliament examines the court's report thoroughly before deciding whether or not to approve the way in which the Commission has handled the budget. The European Court of Auditors also gives its opinion on new or revised EU regulations with financial impact at the request of other EU institutions. The ECU can also issue position papers on other issues on its own initiative without basically needing to be asked by other EU countries to do it. So then the second last thing we want to look at is the Court of Justice in the EU. The role of the Court of Justice is to make sure that EU laws are applied the same way in all EU countries, so that EU law is the same for every EU citizen. The court is made up of one judge from every EU country. The functions of the Court of Justice are as follows. First of all, they advise the national courts. So, the national courts in each EU country are responsible for ensuring that EU law is properly applied in that country. However, there is the risk that courts in different countries might interpret EU law in different ways. To prevent this happening, there is a parliamentary ruling procedure. If a national court is in doubt about the interpretation or the validity of an EU law, it may and sometimes must ask the Court of Justice for advice. Second, it ensures that EU law is obeyed. If one country is failing to fulfil its obligations under EU law, it can be taken to the Court of Justice. The court investigates the allegation and gives its judgment. If the country is found to be at fault, it must put things right at once. If the court finds that the country has not followed its rulings, it can issue a fine. For example, in 2010, a Spanish citizen whose home had once been repossessed complained that it was in breach of his privacy that people could read about his old problem on Google. The case went to the Court of Justice, who found in his favour and ruled that individuals have the right to demand that search engines remove links with personal information about it, if that information is inaccurate, inadequate, irrelevant, or excessive. It is commonly known as the right to be forgotten. So you all have the right to be forgotten. So the third function of the Court of Justice of the EU is to strike down EU laws. If any EU country or institution believes that a particular EU law is illegal, they may ask the court to annul it. EU citizens can also ask the court to cancel a law if it directly affects them in a negative way. If the court finds that the law in question breaks the rules that govern the EU, called the treaties, it will declare that law null and void. So the last thing we want to look at then is the European Council. The European Council is essentially a meeting of the heads of state of government of every EU country, at which they set goals and priorities for the EU. Today, for example, Leo Varadkar is having a video conference meeting with the European Council, where he's going to meet with all the other heads of the EU countries, EU member states, I should say, and they are going to discuss how they should proceed with lessening lockdown restrictions during the coronavirus. The European Council usually meets 4 times a year in Brussels, and its decisions are usually reached by consensus. The meetings are also attended by the President of the European Commission and are chaired by the President of the European Council. The role of the European Council is to set out the general political direction and priorities of the EU and to resolve complex or sensitive issues that cannot be sorted by lower level officials. However, the European Council has no power to pass laws. The European Council nominates the President to the European Commission. It also appoints the other commissioners in agreement with the nominated President. So, decision-making in the EU. How is decision-making done in the EU? The EU tries to benefit all the people in each member state by passing laws to protect and help them. The process of passing laws that suits each country is a complicated one and involves a number of steps. The first step in EU decision-making involves the European Commission. Its job is to initiate legislation in the EU. This means that it thinks up ideas for new laws to protect the EU and its citizens. The Commission consults with the interested parties and experts to make sure that its legislative proposals correspond with the needs of those most concerned and avoids unnecessary red tape. The Commission sends its ideas for a new law to the European Parliament. So stage 2. The next stage is the first reading in the European Parliament. The Parliament debates the proposed new law. It discusses the law's advantages and disadvantages and makes changes to the proposed laws with a view to improve them. These changes are called amendments. It then sends the proposal to the Council of the European Union. Next, the Council of the European Union examines the European Parliament's wording of the proposed law. If it approves of it, the law is adopted in the EU. If it does not approve of the wording, it will make its own addendums to it, which it sends back to the Parliament for a second reading, which explains why it's taking its position. It explains why it wants the amendments added in. If there is a second reading, at this second reading, the Parliament examines the Council of European Union's position, and if it votes to approve it, then it becomes law in the EU. Or the Parliament may reject the Council's position totally, in which case the whole procedure is ended and the proposal does not become law in the EU. Alternatively, the Parliament may propose further amendments and return it to the proposal. Alternatively, the Parliament may propose further amendments and return the proposal to Council for another reading. That's the dog, just to make life interesting. At its second reading, the Council of EU examines the Parliament's second reading position and either approves all of the Parliament's amendment, meaning that the Act is adopted and becomes law in the EU, or it does not approve all amendments, leading to the convention of the Conciliation Committee. Now, the Conciliation Committee is composed of equal members of MEPs, that's members of the European Parliament, and Council representatives. And they try to find a solution to the impasse where they're not agreeing on the law, where the Parliament and the Council are in disagreement about the law. These are like mediators, the Conciliation Committee, and they try and negotiate between the two parties to come up with a solution. If, however, they're unsuccessful, the proposal does not become law in the EU and the procedure is ended. If a joint text is agreed by the committee, it is forwarded to the European Parliament and Council for a third reading. So then this joint text goes before the Parliament and the Council of the European Union for a third reading. Neither is allowed to change the wording of it. The Council of the European Union and the European Parliament both vote on the text. If both vote yes, then it becomes law in the EU by means of a directive, a regulation, or a decision. If either of these institutions vote no to the proposal, it does not become law in the EU. The role of special interest groups in EU decision-making. An interest group is an organisation of people who come together to fight for a common goal. By joining forces, they have more power, more money, and more talents at their disposal, and hence are more likely to be listened to by the decision makers. There are thousands of these special interest groups in the EU, including Amnesty International, the Irish Business and Employers Confederation, known as IBEC. So again, if you see the letters IBEC, IBEC, in your short questions, it stands for Irish Business and Employers Confederation. That's IBEC, IBEC. And the Irish Farmers Association, represented by the letters IFA. So if you see the letters IFA and you have to say what they mean, it's the Irish Farmers Association. Special interest groups will try to influence the decision-making process to ensure that the laws they want are passed and the laws that do not suit them fail. The aim of special interest groups is to pressure the EU decision-making people into making decisions that help the group to achieve its aims. Special interest groups will try to influence the decision-making process to ensure that the laws that they want are passed and the laws that don't suit them fail. For example, IBEC will try to get the EU to make decisions to help Irish business people. IBEC has an office in Brussels. It uses this to meet with, write to and phone EU decision makers so that they can put forward the case of Irish business people. Special interest groups do the following to achieve their aim. So first of all, they lobby. That means they speak to, phone, write to, annoy basically members of the European Parliament or MEPs. Special interest groups will phone, write to and meet with MPs to try and persuade them to vote in a certain way. They will send a petition to the European Parliament about an issue they feel strongly about in order to pressurise the MEPs into doing something about it. For example, before the European Parliament voted to tax airline entourage, For example, before the European Parliament voted to tax airlines to encourage them to reduce their CO2 emissions, the Chief Executive Officer of Aer Lingus wrote to every MEP asking them to vote against the proposal because obviously it will cost them money to change the way they fuel their airlines and how they'd have to change the output of their CO2 emissions. So, often the decisions that the lobbyists are trying to get through are in the best interest of the lobbyists, not necessarily in the best interest of the environment or the people in general. It's for the vested interest of their tiny little group. They also can lobby the European Commissioners and the European Commission and individual commissioners. Before it can think up new laws, the Commission has to be aware of the problems in the EU that need to be solved. This is where special interest groups really come into their own. They meet with the commissioners and they make them aware of the particular issues they are concerned about, and they try to influence them into doing something to sort it out. Thus, they can plant the idea for a new law they want in the heads of the commissioners, who might then draft a proposal for that law. Therefore, special interest groups might sometimes initiate the ideas that eventually become EU laws. They also get to influence the Commission when it holds its public consultations on proposals of new laws. Special interest group, then, the third thing they do is they set up an office in Brussels. Many EU decisions are made in Brussels, so special interest groups set up offices in Brussels in order to